Hey guys, tonight we slip into the gaslit haze of Victorian London, where the streets stay awake almost as stubbornly as the people inside the brick townhouses. You can imagine it, fog curling around lampposts, the uneven cobblestones beneath your shoes, and neighbors peeking through lace curtains at odd hours of the night. It's the 19th century, and insomnia has become both a nuisance and a fashionable complaint. You might even call it the Netflix of its time, except instead of binge-watching, you're pacing back and forth in a nightshirt, listening to the coal fire wheeze. And just a little reality check here. If you actually had to try one of these cures yourself, you probably wouldn't survive this long in the story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up late with me, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Asterisk, you find yourself moving through this restless city, where sleeplessness isn't just an inconvenience, it's practically a cultural badge. Doctors, pamphleteers, and nervous patients are all talking about it. Victorians believed insomnia was more than just tossing and turning. They thought it was a symptom of moral failure, weak nerves, or the toll of industrial modernity. By the 1850s, the word insomnia had become fashionable in medical circles, though people had obviously been sleepless long before then. What's new here is how the Victorians diagnosed it, named it, and sold it back to themselves in tiny bottles with fancy labels. The gaslight in your imagined bedroom flickers, and you hear a carriage rattle by outside. The Victorians were living in an era of rapid change railways stretched across the countryside. Telegraphs tapped messages faster than anyone could fall asleep, and factories belched smoke that never seemed to rest. In the middle of this whirlwind, people noticed they were lying awake longer, perhaps because the rhythms of nature had been interrupted by all that artificial light and noise. Historians still argue whether this industrial restlessness was more perception than reality, but the complaints filled newspapers and doctors' journals all the same. Asterisk, picture yourself as a middle-class clerk in London, reading a medical handbook by candlelight. The book scolds you. Your sleeplessness may be your own fault, caused by too much coffee, heavy reading at night, or you guessed it, an overexcited imagination. One physician warned sternly against reading sensational novels after supper, as though a chapter of Dickens was enough to condemn you to eternal wakefulness. Another insisted that sleeplessness could arise from improper digestion. So if you thought that late-night snack of mutton pie would help, well, bad news. You've just doomed yourself to another restless evening. Asterisk, and if you were wealthy, insomnia became almost a social accessory. Aristocrats and literati would drop casual remarks about their delicate nerves or restless minds. Think of it like the Victorian equivalent of humble bragging about how busy you are today. A famous poet might declare, with a sigh, that his art kept him awake at night, and everyone would nod sympathetically, as though sleeplessness were proof of genius. You, meanwhile, might just be awake because the neighbor's baby wouldn't stop crying, or because the coal fire filled your room with smoke. Asterisk, quirky detail here. Some Victorians kept sleep diaries, where they meticulously logged not only how many hours they managed to get, but also what they ate, what they read, and even whether the moonlight fell across their pillow. One diarist recorded that a squeaky mouse in his bedroom cost him exactly 45 minutes of rest, which is either obsessive honesty or the most polite excuse for being cranky at breakfast. Asterisk, as you wander through this imagined city, you notice that insomnia wasn't seen as neutral. It was tangled up with morality. Doctors warned that idleness, indulgence, and sinful living led to restless nights. And yet, the same physicians wrote long, meandering case studies that must have kept their readers wide awake. You can almost hear the irony. The cure for insomnia might just be reading about insomnia. Asterisk, of course, sleeplessness wasn't limited to men. Women, especially middle-class ones, were often diagnosed with hysteria, and insomnia was folded neatly into that catch-all category. If you complained of poor sleep, your doctor might pat you on the head metaphorically and prescribe more fresh air, more needlework, or rather less kindly fewer novels. The assumption was that women's minds were too excitable for their bodies, which is both insulting and, let's be honest, not particularly helpful when you're lying awake at 2 a.m. counting cracks in the ceiling plaster. Asterisk, and let's not forget the working poor. While fashionable patients worried about their delicate nerves, laborers had no choice but to keep working shifts that often ran deep into the night. For them, insomnia wasn't so much a diagnosis as a fact of survival. Coal miners, factory workers, and servants rarely appeared in medical case studies. Yet their exhaustion hummed through the city like background noise. Asterisk, the most mainstream fact here is simple. Insomnia in the Victorian era was recognized, debated, and medicalized in ways that hadn't existed before. People gave it a name, studied it, and even treated it as a cultural epidemic. The quirky tidbit? Some Victorians swore by sleeping with a lump of raw potato in their pocket, claiming it drew away nervous energies. No wonder their beds smelled strange. And the scholarly debate still stands. Were Victorians actually more sleepless than their ancestors? Or did the rise of medicine, print culture, and self-help manuals just make them talk about it more? Asterisk. So, as you shuffle through these London streets, watching lamps burn late into the night and hearing the rustle of turning pages, you realize insomnia wasn't just a private battle. It was a mirror held up to an anxious, fast-moving society. And in the chapters, or rather, the sleepless hours to come, you'll sample their many cures, from laughably strange to quietly soothing, each one a reflection of its restless age. Asterisk. You stand in a Victorian apothecary now, the air thick with the smell of camphor, lavender oil, and something faintly metallic. Rows of brown glass bottles line the shelves, their labels painted in fine script that promises relief, soothing repose, or a guaranteed night's sleep. But as you peer closer, you realize these patent medicines are less about gentle dreams and more about what we'd call chemical trickery. Asterisk, the Victorian patent medicine industry was booming. Anybody with a catchy brand name and a willingness to mix alcohol with opium could market their potion as a cure for sleeplessness. Some of the most popular insomnia remedies contained laudanum, a potent tincture of opium in alcohol. Just imagine taking a spoonful before bed. Instead of gently drifting off, you're knocked into a narcotic haze, only to wake up the next morning groggy, dependent, and sometimes craving more. And here's the mainstream fact. Laudanum was perfectly legal, sold openly, and considered almost respectable. Asterisk, you take a sip, don't worry. Only in imagination, and feel the slow burn of alcohol slide down your throat. A label proclaims it will quiet the nerves and charm the restless brain. Charming, indeed. The real charm is how the manufacturers gloss over the part where you might end up addicted. Historians still argue whether Victorians actually understood the risks of these potions, or whether they collectively chose to ignore them, much like how we ignore that third cup of coffee today. Asterisk, of course. Not all bottles contained heavy narcotics. Some offered milder cocktails of herbs, spiked with just enough alcohol to keep customers happy. Others included bromides, chemical salts that genuinely suppressed the nervous system. One quirky detail: bromide salts were known to dull not only anxiety, but also libido, which earned them a reputation as a cure for too much energy in the marital bed. The irony is almost two perfect people were so worried that sleeplessness came from sinful behavior that they used a cure that conveniently killed both urges at once. Asterisk. Picture yourself chatting with the apothecary behind the counter. He's in a tidy waistcoat, proudly displaying testimonials written in flowery handwriting. After 3 spoonfuls of Dr. Gregory's restorative syrup, I slept like a babe, and my constitution has never been more robust. You almost want to chuckle robust? After downing an opiate cocktail? That's like saying you feel healthy after eating 6 cupcakes, because you also drank a glass of water, asterisk. And yet, there's no denying the appeal. Sleeplessness is maddening, and when someone dangles a quick solution, you reach for it. Victorians were no different. They lined up for tonics, syrups, drops, lozenges, and powders, each one promising to conquer insomnia. Some doctors even compounded their own recipes, mixing chloral hydrate or morphine into sweet syrups. Chloral hydrate, by the way, was notorious for producing deep unconsciousness. It was one of the first widely used sleeping pills. But as you might guess, the hangover effect was brutal, leaving people sluggish, foggy, and sometimes worse off than before. Asterisk, you wander deeper into the apothecary, where shelves give way to advertisements plastered on the wall. Colorful posters show peaceful women reclining in bed, clutching a bottle of syrup with angelic smiles. You know, in that way, ads always oversell the dream literally, in this case. One famous slogan promised, no tossing, no turning, no dreadful dreams, just gentle slumber. You almost expect soft harp music to play in the background. Instead, the city outside honks and hisses, reminding you that reality was far messier. Asterisk, let's slip in a fun tidbit. Some remedies were so heavily alcoholic that they doubled as social drinks. A nightcap wasn't just a metaphor. It was often a patented sleeping cordial. You can almost imagine a dinner guest whispering, "Excuse me, I can't sleep without my syrup," and then happily pouring a glass in front of everyone. That's not so different from us today, reaching for a sneaky glass of wine and calling it medicine. Asterisk, but behind the humor, there's a darker undercurrent. Addictions bloomed quietly. People who thought they were treating insomnia sometimes found themselves needing larger doses to get the same effect. Newspapers occasionally reported scandalous cases of otherwise respectable citizens ruined by their reliance on tonics. Doctors debated, was this truly a cure or just another trap? And here we circle back to that scholarly debate. Did Victorians sincerely believe these concoctions worked? Or did they knowingly choose them because, frankly, they worked in the short term? Asterisk, you step back outside, holding a little vial in your hand, and the fog curls around you. The city hums with restless life, and you realize that these medicines weren't just about sleep. They were about selling comfort in a restless age. Maybe you'd drift off after a dose. Maybe you'd stay awake, buzzing with side effects. Either way, the apothecaries made their money. And sleepless Victorians lined up again tomorrow. Asterisk. The irony isn't lost on you. The very cures meant to bring quiet nights often guaranteed more wakefulness in the long run. It's like trying to put out a fire with lamp oil. It might dim the flames for a moment, but the blaze will return twice as bright. And here, in this softly lit street, you're left with the strange comfort of knowing that sleepless people across time have always reached for the same thing, a bottle that promises more than it can deliver. You leave the glowing apothecary behind and wander down a quieter lane with a sense change. Instead of the chemical tongue of laudanum and bromides, you're greeted by something gentler, the earthy sweetness of chamomile, the green bite of lettuce leaves, and the warm, faintly creamy aroma of milk simmering in a pot. These are the remedies that don't require a prescription, only a patient hand and a kitchen fire. Asterisk Victorian households were full of these folk cures, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from neighbor to neighbor. A simple cup of chamomile tea was considered almost magical. You sit at a kitchen table while a matronly figure plucks tiny daisy-like blossoms, drying them in bunches near the stove. Chamomile had been used for centuries across Europe as a calming herb, and Victorian doctors nodded approvingly, even if only because it gave them something harmless to recommend. Mainstream fact: chamomile was so commonly advised for insomnia that it appeared in multiple editions of the 19th century. Household physician guides. Asterisk: you sip the tea, warm and slightly bitter, and let your imagination drift. Would it work? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue whether the mild sedative effects of chamomile were noticeable to people accustomed to stronger potions, or whether the real comfort was ritual, the quiet act, sipping something warm before bed. Convincing yourself you are already drowsy. Asterisk. Then there's lettuce. Yes, lettuce. You picture a Victorian cook peeling off broad leaves and boiling them into a pale green broth. The idea was that lettuce contained a milky sap, sometimes called lettuce opium, that could calm the nerves. Quirky tidbit here. In some households, people swore by slipping a single lettuce leaf under the pillow, as though the mere proximity of salad could coax you into slumber. If nothing else, it made the bed smell faintly like a picnic. Asterisk, and of course, the eternal classic: warm milk. Picture the saucepan gently bubbling on the iron stove, the milk whisked with a little nutmeg or cinnamon. Victorians clung to this cure, believing that the fats and natural sugars lulled the stomach and, by extension, the brain. It's a sweet notion until you remember that milk wasn't always pasteurized, and the odd sour sip might keep you awake for entirely different reasons. You almost want to chuckle. Nothing like a dose of stomach cramps to distract you from your insomnia. Asterisk, but not all kitchen cures were cozy. Some households experimented with stranger ingredients. Vinegar possets, hot milk curdled with vinegar, were thought to quiet restlessness. The smell alone is enough to keep anyone wide awake, but people dutifully sipped them down. Others believed in onions, sliced and left beside the bed to draw out nervous vapors. The only thing those onions reliably did was make the room smell like last night's stew. Still, the faith was there. And faith, more than science, often determined whether the remedy worked. Asterisk, you step into another parlor where a kindly gentleman is preparing what he calls a hop pillow. Hops, the same plant used to brew beer, were stuffed into little cloth sachets and tucked into pillows, releasing a faintly bitter aroma. The theory was that if hops could make beer soothing, then sniffing them might lull you too. Imagine falling asleep with your nose pressed to a pillow that smells like an old brewery, comforting to some. Perhaps less so if you're not fond of beer. Asterisk, through all this, you notice a common thread. These remedies were safe, harmless, and probably more about the bedtime routine than the ingredients themselves. There's a gentle truth in that. Sometimes the ritual, the soft light, the warm drink, the moment of slowing down is enough to trick your body into winding down. Even today, sleep specialists advise us to build rituals. No screens, dim lights, a hot beverage. Maybe the Victorians, with their simple lettuce broths and chamomile infusions, were onto something we've only recently rediscovered. Asterisk. And here's your scholarly debate moment. Were these household cures genuinely effective pharmacologically, or did they function mainly as placebos? Some argue that chamomile contains mild sedatives, yes, but nowhere near the potency of laudanum. Others counter that the Victorians didn't need pharmacological proof. They just needed something they could believe in. That belief plus the boredom of drinking boiled lettuce water might have been soporific enough. Asterisk, picture yourself finishing your mug of milk, wiping the foam from your upper lip. The room is quiet. The coals in the fireplace glow faintly, and for a moment, you do feel heavier, slower. Then, outside, a carriage rattles by, shaking the window glass. You sigh. Maybe the cure worked for a minute. Maybe it didn't. But there's something comforting about the effort, the sense that you've done your part, followed the advice, and given yourself permission to rest. Asterisk, it's a gentler side of Victorian insomnia kitchens full of warm steam, gardens full of herbs, neighbors exchanging tips over tea. Compared to the harsh chemicals of the apothecary, these remedies feel quaint, harmless, and in their own way, soothing. Even if you stayed awake, at least you had something warm to sip, and maybe that was half the battle. You leave the kitchen comforts behind and step into a curious Victorian drawing room. Its shelves cluttered not with teapots, but with brass gears, straps, and curious-looking wooden boxes. This is the world of sleep gadgets, the ingenious, sometimes ridiculous contraptions that promise to lull you into slumber with the help of mechanical ingenuity. The only problem? Most of them worked about as well as trying to nap inside a blacksmith's workshop. On a polished mahogany table rests a sleep helmet, a padded contraption meant to hold the head in just the right angle to prevent tossing and turning. The straps squeak as you imagine fastening them. The padding feels oddly lumpy, and you quickly realize this helmet is less of a dream machine and more of a medieval torture light accessory. Mainstream fact: such devices were advertised in periodicals, pitched as scientifically designed supports for the restless. The Victorians loved slapping the word scientific on just about anything, even if it was really just cloth, buckles, and misplaced optimism. Next, your eye falls on a Somnia clock, an invention combining an alarm clock with a bed-shaking mechanism. The idea wasn't to wake you up, it was to jiggle you gently, simulating the soothing motion of a cradle. The problem? Instead of rocking you to dreamland, it usually rattled the entire bed frame like a cheap carnival ride. You chuckle. Imagine being half asleep when your mattress suddenly vibrates like a runaway horse cart. Some inventors insisted it worked, but historians still argue whether these designs were ever more than conversation pieces, gathering dust in the corners of fashionable bedrooms. And then there's the air pump pillow. The theory was that changing air pressure around the head would relax the brain. A rubber bladder was inflated under your pillow, allowing you to adjust firmness while supposedly regulating your cerebral circulation. Quirky tidbit: some users claimed it gave them vivid dreams of flying. More likely, it just gave them a stiff neck and a suspicious squeak every time they rolled over. Victorians also adored magnetic cures. You step into another room where a gentleman demonstrates a magneto-electric sleep belt strapped across the chest. It hummed faintly as currents passed through coils, the inventor promising it would calm the nervous system. In practice, it delivered tiny shocks that were more startling than soothing. Imagine trying to drift off while feeling like a telegraph wire had just tapped you goodnight. Let's not forget the bizarre ear tickler. This device, found in an 1880s advertisement, was supposed to gently stroke the inside of the ear canal to relax the nerves. Yes, really. The concept was that the auditory nerves controlled sleep rhythms. What it mostly controlled was whether you shouted, "Get that thing away from me." Despite the absurdity, these gadgets reflect a deeper truth. Victorians were enthralled by technology. The same era that birthed locomotives and telegraphs also believed that machinery could solve personal, intimate problems like insomnia. You can sense the optimism. If a machine could send a message across the Atlantic, surely another machine could send you off to dreamland. But did they work? Scholars still debate whether any of these contraptions offered real physiological benefits, or whether they just provided distraction. Maybe fiddling with a gadget, strapping yourself into belts and helmets, was tiring enough to make you fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. After all, few things drain your energy like wrestling with complicated straps at midnight dot in the corner of the room. A salesman gives a demonstration. He winds up a clockwork device, and a set of weighted hammers begin tapping rhythmically against a wooden headboard, mimicking the sound of distant rainfall. You lean back, almost charmed, until one hammer slips, delivering a loud clang that would jolt even the deepest sleeper awake. The poor salesman blushes, assures the crowd it's merely an adjustment issue, and hurriedly rewinds the mechanism. Quirky or not, these gadgets tell you something about Victorian life. People wanted tangible, mechanical solutions. Bottles of syrup felt too mysterious, herbs too uncertain. But a gadget, with its gears and coils, seemed like modern progress. It was comfort disguised as science. Even when it failed, it reassured buyers that they were at least trying something practical. Imagine tucking yourself into a heavy, iron-framed bed, strapping on a magnetic belt, setting your Insomnia clock, and resting your head against an inflatable pillow. The contraptions buzz faintly, the straps itch, and the clock ticks like a metronome on caffeine. Instead of sleep, you end up with a headache, a stiff neck, and the lingering suspicion that you've been conned. And yet, the Victorians kept buying. Hope, after all, sells just as well as results. You leave the gadget-filled parlor with a smile. Strange as they were, these contraptions capture something timeless. Our endless, restless desire to engineer a shortcut to sleep. Whether it's a vibrating mattress in 1880 or a smartphone sleep app in 2025, the promise remains the same, just one more invention, and you'll finally drift off. You step out of the gadget parlor and into a hushed Victorian consulting room, where heavy curtains block the street lamps, and the faint smell of ink and leather hovers in the air. A doctor, his beard immaculately trimmed, gestures for you to sit. His desk is piled with thick casebooks, each filled with page after page of patients complaining of sleepless nights. Instead of pulling out a bottle or a gadget, he begins what you quickly realize is his specialty, talking. Or more precisely, lecturing until you nearly nod off from sheer boredom. * mainstream fact. Victorian physicians increasingly believed that insomnia was a disorder of the nerves, caused by mental overexcitement. And so, rather than prescribe only physical remedies, some doctors turned to treatments that involved the mind itself. Hypnosis, or mesmerism, became a fashionable cure. Imagine reclining in a high-backed chair while the doctor waves his hand rhythmically in front of your eyes, speaking in a low monotone. You feel heavy. You feel calm. It sounds suspiciously like every YouTube sleep channel you've ever tried, except this one comes with a fee and a man in a frock coat leaning a little too close. The irony is delicious. Some patients swore hypnosis worked, while others admitted the sessions just left them more self-conscious than ever. Historians still argue whether Victorian hypnosis actually induced meaningful sleep, or whether it was just a glorified placebo. Either way, it gave people the reassuring feeling that their doctor was paying close attention, an underrated form of medicine. But hypnosis wasn't the only tool. Some physicians favored what we might call bedside sermons. Picture yourself listening as the doctor slowly recites long passages from moral texts, droning on about moderation, discipline, and the dangers of excess. He truly believes that a firm lecture on virtue will calm your restless brain. In practice, the monotone is so soporific that you fight to stay awake just to hear the end. It's possible these sessions work less as therapy and more as accidental bedtime stories for adults. You glance around the room and notice stacks of pamphlets and books with titles like The Nerve Cure and On Sleeplessness in Clerks and Clergy. The doctor waves proudly at them, encouraging you to read them slowly each night. You almost laugh. If the cure for insomnia is reading a 400-page tract on digestion, then maybe insomnia wasn't such a problem after all. Quirky tidbit. Some physicians recommended reciting multiplication tables backwards as a mental exercise to lull the brain. The theory was that boredom plus concentration would untangle the nerves. You try it for a moment. 12 times 12 is 144. 12 times 11 is 132. You realize that, yes, you are yawning, but more from irritation than drowsiness. Asterisk still, there were patients who genuinely believed in these consultations. They described leaving the doctor's office feeling calmer, reassured by the sense of order and authority. That reassurance may have mattered more than any lecture or hypnotic trick. In an age when the world was speeding up, railways rushing, factories roaring, just sitting still with someone telling you it was going to be fine might have been a rare luxury. Asterisk, and yet, you can't help but notice the contradictions. Doctors warned against overstimulation, yet some also suggested stimulating conversations as a cure. Others believed vigorous late-night walks through city streets would wear out the restless mind. Imagine trudging in circles, listening to your boots slap against cobblestones, only to come home too chilled and stiff to sleep. A cure had become the cause. Asterisk. Historians still debate whether these talking cures actually had therapeutic merit, or whether they simply revealed how desperate Victorians were to intellectualize their sleeplessness. After all, if you were an educated gentleman, it felt more dignified to say your doctor treated you with hypnosis than to admit you'd fallen asleep after half a glass of port and a boring sermon. Asterisk before you leave. The doctor insists on one final demonstration. He dims the gas lamps, takes a pendulum watch from his pocket, and swings it gently before your eyes. His voice drops into a soothing cadence. You are drowsy. Very drowsy. You stifle a laugh, because instead of sinking into trance, you're distracted by the tick of the clock, the squeak of his shoes, and the faint smell of ink-stained fingers. The entire scene feels less like science and more like amateur theater. But then again, maybe theater was the point. If you believed, even a little, that you'd been guided towards sleep, perhaps that was enough. Asterisk, as you step out into the night air, you realize something important. Victorian insomnia cures weren't just chemical, herbal, or mechanical. They were also psychological. The mind was both the battlefield and the treatment ground. And sometimes, whether through hypnosis, lectures, or tedious multiplication tables, people managed to trick themselves into drifting off. Not exactly a cure, but perhaps a kind of comfort. Asterisk. You wander further into the Victorian night, and overhear hushed whispers in a small bookshop tucked between a tailor's and a bakery. Inside, the shelves are stacked not just with novels, but with pamphlets warning about dangers far more personal than sleeplessness. The titles leap out at you. Self-abuse and the ruin of youth. The wasting of vital forces, and insomnia as the punishment of sin. You tilt your head. Amused, because it turns out that for many Victorians, insomnia wasn't only a medical complaint, it was framed as a moral failing. And the favorite culprit was masturbation. Asterisk. Mainstream fact. 19th century doctors and moralists linked insomnia directly to what they delicately called self-abuse. The belief was that solitary vice depleted the body's energy reserves and left the nervous system overstimulated, unable to calm itself into sleep. You can almost hear the lecture now. Young man, if you cannot sleep, it is surely because you have squandered your vital essence. Subtlety was not the strong suit of these pamphlets. Asterisk quirky tidbit. Some authors seriously recommended bizarre deterrents to protect against this cause of sleeplessness. Boys were told to wear spiked rings around their fingers to prevent nighttime touching. Others were encouraged to sleep with their hands tied outside the bed covers. Imagine trying to nod off like that arms, bound like a Victorian Houdini act, while being scolded for your own restlessness. The only thing you're guaranteed is numb fingers, not a peaceful night. Asterisk, as you flip through one pamphlet, you notice the tone is half sermon, half comedy routine, though it wasn't meant that way. One stern author insisted that nocturnal emissions could keep a man awake for hours, as though his body had scheduled insomnia as divine punishment. Another declared that a sleepless night was God's way of highlighting guilt, a spiritual alarm clock ringing until the sinner confessed. You almost want to joke. Imagine blaming every bout of tossing and turning on your conscience rather than on the neighbor's snoring baby. Asterisk, but the moral panic went beyond pamphlets. Doctors sometimes reinforced these fears, prescribing moral hygiene as a solution. Patients were told to avoid spicy foods, novels, and even soft feather beds, since comfort itself was considered suspicious. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed in these connections, or whether they simply rode the wave of public anxiety to gain authority. Either way, their advice could sound more like parental nagging than medical instruction. Asterisk, women weren't spared, though their sleeplessness was often tied to hysteria. A woman unable to sleep was warned against overexcited imagination, excessive reading, or spending too much time with novels about romance. Yes, even Jane Austen might have been blamed for your 2 a.m. restlessness. The underlying message was clear. Stay disciplined, stay restrained, and your pillow will reward you. Asterisk, in one particularly theatrical case report, a doctor claimed that a young man was cured of insomnia only after embracing a life of piety and physical austerity. He gave up tea, novels, and youthful indiscretions, and suddenly his nights were quiet. You can almost picture him lying rigid in bed, afraid to move, terrified that any sign of comfort might bring on wakefulness again. If he slept, it was probably from exhaustion rather than virtue. Asterisk, yet, for all the stern finger wagging, the irony shines through. These moral warnings likely kept people more anxious, not less. Imagine lying in bed, restless, and remembering a pamphlet that insisted your sleeplessness meant you were secretly guilty. That's not a recipe for relaxation. It's a recipe for staring at the ceiling until dawn, convinced your very soul is buzzing louder than the gas lamps outside. Asterisk, the scholarly debate here lingers. Were Victorians truly plagued by insomnia because of these fears? Or did moralists merely take advantage of common sleeplessness to preach virtue? Some historians argue the pamphlets tell us more about Victorian anxieties than about actual sleep patterns. After all, insomnia has always existed, but only in certain eras do people decide it must mean you're morally corrupt. Asterisk, you step back into the street, pamphlet still in hand, and the absurdity sticks with you. It's both funny and a little sad. People who just needed a glass of water, a quieter bed, or maybe fewer onions under their pillows were instead told they were sinners. And if they weren't sleepless before, the guilt alone would probably keep them up until sunrise. You drift now toward the kitchens and dining halls of Victorian Britain, where another theory of sleeplessness waits on the table quite literally. For many physicians, insomnia was the stomach's fault. The brain, they said, couldn't possibly relax if digestion was too lively, or if certain foods whipped up nervous energy. And so, the Victorians crafted a long list of dietary rules for sleep, some logical, some absurd, and some that might keep you wide awake just from sheer discomfort. Asterisk, the mainstream fact is straightforward. By the mid-19th century, diet manuals often included sections on sleep. Heavy dinners, especially meat and rich puddings, were blamed for restlessness. Doctors advised plain, simple meals before bed-boiled beef, dry toast, porridge without sugar. You sit down at a polished oak table and stare at your plate of grayish beef and limp toast. Appetite gone. You wonder if the cure for insomnia was simply starving yourself until you passed out. Asterisk, one quirky tidbit. Lettuce broth returned here too, but not for flavor. Some diet guides insisted you should combine boiled lettuce with vinegar as a pre-sleep tonic. The sour smell hits your nose and you nearly gag, but the text insists it soothes the digestion. Another household tip? A cup of barley water, essentially cloudy liquid left from boiling barley grains. Comforting in theory, bland in reality. You sip, and it tastes like someone washed their socks in a kettle. Asterisk. But perhaps the strangest part of these rules was the suspicion toward foods we find innocent today. Tomatoes were eyed suspiciously, thought to overstimulate the blood. Spices, especially cinnamon and nutmeg, were accused of agitating the nerves, despite being the same ingredients added to sleep-friendly warm milk. And chocolate, newly popular in Victorian parlors, was sometimes condemned as a stimulant. Imagine being told that your evening cocoa was secretly plotting against your dreams. Asterisk. Doctors weren't shy about prescribing entire diets as therapy. One recommended that chronic insomniacs avoid vegetables altogether, claiming their rough fibers irritated the gut. Another insisted milk and farinaceous foods, think starches like rice and bread, were the safest. The result? Bland plates piled high with carbs, the kind of meal that might make you drowsy only because chewing through it was so monotonous. Asterisk. Yet, the social class divide revealed itself again. For wealthy Victorians, dietary prescriptions became almost fashionable menus designed with sleep in mind, like beef tea and unsalted biscuits served at supper. For the poor, insomnia was rarely a choice. Factory workers often ate whatever they could afford, usually heavy bread and cheese, late at night after exhausting shifts. Historians still argue whether diet truly played as large a role in insomnia as doctors claimed, or whether it simply became a convenient theory for an age obsessed with self-discipline. Asterisk. Here's where you notice the comic undertones. Imagine a respectable gentleman excusing himself from a lavish dinner, saying, "Ah, no pudding for me. My nerves are delicate." Or picture a lady sipping her unsweetened porridge with the solemn conviction that it will bring her 8 hours of blissful rest. The earnestness almost makes you smile. Asterisk. And then there were midnight snacks, which some doctors actually encouraged. A small bite of bread or a glass of warm milk, they argued, could ease digestion and calm the nerves. But heaven forbid you reached for cheese was condemned as a nightmare inducer, said to lie heavily on the brain. You can almost picture a poor soul waking at 3 a.m., sweating, convinced it was the cheddar's fault. Asterisk. In one particularly eccentric cookbook, the author insisted that cold cabbage taken at bedtime was excellent for soothing wakefulness. You laugh softly. Cold cabbage? That's not a recipe. That's a punishment. And yet, Victorians wrote these instructions with absolute seriousness, their confidence unwavering. Asterisk. The scholarly debate here lingers like a sour aftertaste. Was diet truly central to Victorian insomnia? Or was it another way to enforce discipline? A reminder to eat plain, avoid indulgence, and live moderately? Some argue that these rules reflected broader anxieties about gluttony and morality. After all, if sleeplessness could be blamed on overindulgence at the table, then restraint became not just virtuous, but medicinal. Asterisk. You finish your plate of plain toast, dab your mouth with a stiff linen napkin, and push back your chair. Do you feel sleepier? Maybe, but mostly you feel robbed of dessert. And as you shuffle away, you can't help thinking the real cure wasn't on the plate at all. It was the quiet, dim dining room, the absence of clatter, the steady slowing of the evening. A ritual disguised as a diet. You step away from the dreary dining tables and find yourself in a Victorian apothecary's back room that smells exotic spices, dried roots, powders in neatly labeled jars. Here, sleeplessness isn't treated with broth or bland beef. Instead, you're introduced to the thrilling promise of imported remedies, substances gathered from across the empire and beyond. If a cure came with the scent of the foreign or the shimmer of the scientific, Victorians were eager to try it, even if it meant spending the night jittery instead of drowsy. Asterisk. The mainstream fact is that one of the most common prescriptions for insomnia by the late 1800s was bromide salts. Doctors praised potassium bromide for calming excessive nervous excitation. You can almost see the chemist measuring pale crystals into paper packets, folding them carefully, and handing them over with solemn instructions. Take 1 spoonful dissolved in water before retiring. What he doesn't say is that bromides dulled the libido and sometimes left patients sluggish for days. Entire sanatoriums used bromides liberally, almost as a way to keep their patients placid. Asterisk. Then there's valerian root, a herb with a long history, stretching back to Greek and Roman medicine. In Victorian Britain, it was imported, bottled, and sold with labels promising tranquil repose. You lean close to one jar and catch its pungent, musky smell. Some compared it to old socks. Yet countless patients swore it worked, praising its dream-inducing qualities. Quirky tidbit. Cats loved valerian too, reacting to it much like catnip. Picture an insomniac struggling to sleep while their feline rolled ecstatically on the valerian sachet meant for the pillow. Asterisk. Another fashionable cure came from South America. Coca leaves. Long before cocaine became a household warning, Victorians experimented with coca tonics that promised to invigorate by day and calm by night. The contradiction was glaring, but clever marketers argued that coca balanced the nervous system. Imagine sipping a syrup infused with coca and lying in bed convinced of your serenity while your pulse tapped like a telegraph key. Historians still argue whether these tonics genuinely had calming phases or whether customers simply talked themselves into believing it. And then there was chloral hydrate, sometimes nicknamed Mickey Finn when misused, but in medicine touted as the first true sleeping pill. By the 1870s, it was prescribed widely for insomnia. Taken in small doses, it knocked patients into heavy unconsciousness. But the side effects were brutal. Headaches, nausea, lingering fog. You imagine waking at noon, head throbbing and muttering, "Well, I suppose technically I did sleep." Chloral hydrate's popularity grew until doctors realized it was habit-forming, and patients demanded ever stronger doses. Asterisk. In the crowded apothecary, you notice colorful advertisements pinned on the wall. One shows a woman drifting serenely in a hammock of clouds, cradling a bottle of bromide syrup. Another depicts a weary clerk transformed into a vigorous gentleman after just one night on valerian drops. You smile. The marketing promised not just rest, but reinvention. Insomnia wasn't just sleeplessness. It was a threat to productivity, to morality, even to masculinity. And so, the cure had to restore more than sleep. It had to restore identity. Asterisk, of course, many households couldn't afford the imported remedies or the newest chemicals. Instead, they relied on local apothecaries who mixed their own brews, sometimes a pinch of valerian, sometimes a dash of bromide, sometimes both. The results varied wildly. Some patients slept soundly. Others reported vivid dreams of falling, flying, or wandering foreign landscapes, convinced the medicine had transported them elsewhere. You wonder if that wasn't half the appeal who needs sleep, when you can have a hallucinatory adventure from the comfort of your own bed. Asterisk. The scholarly debate is ongoing. Did these exotic imports actually improve sleep, or did their mystique simply give patients confidence? Some argue valerian has genuine sedative compounds. Others counter that doses were inconsistent, often too weak or too strong. As for bromides and chloral hydrate, their chemical effects are undeniable, but the long-term consequences, addiction, dullness, depression may have made matters worse. Asterisk. Quirky detail. Some Victorians even experimented with inhaling carbonic acid gas for sleep, a practice believed to oxygenate the nerves. Patients reclined in specially built chambers, breathing the faintly fizzy air, as though they were human soda water. Whether it worked or not, you can imagine the odd sensation of drifting toward dreams with bubbles tickling your throat. Asterisk. As you leave the apothecary's back room, clutching a small bottle of valerian tincture. The city's fog seems thicker, the lamps hazier. You realize these exotic remedies weren't just about curing insomnia. They were about adventure, novelty, the promise that somewhere, in the far reaches of empire or in the cutting-edge laboratory, a solution awaited. And maybe, just maybe, that hope was enough to carry a restless Victorian through another long, sleepless night. Asterisk. You step out of the apothecary and wander into a genteel townhouse, the sort of place where chandeliers drip with crystal and every surface seems smothered in velvet or brocade. Here, sleeplessness isn't blamed on drugs or diets, but on the bedroom itself. Victorians were obsessed with domestic management, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their attempts to design the perfect sleep environment. The irony? Many of their fashionable choices made the bedroom a terrible place to rest. Mainstream fact: the 19th century saw a boom in sleep hygiene advice, though the phrase itself hadn't been coined yet. Doctors and homemakers alike emphasized proper ventilation, correct bedding, and the arrangement of furniture. But their advice collided with fashion trends, and fashion nearly always won. You stand at the threshold of a Victorian bedroom, thick draperies blocking the windows, coal smoke hanging in the air, and dozens of knickknacks cluttering every surface. The word restful doesn't exactly come to mind. Take the bed itself. Victorians loved heavy wooden frames with ornate carvings, surrounded by thick hangings that trapped dust and soot. Feather mattresses sagged in the middle, so that couples often rolled together unwillingly in the night. The doctors complained. These beds were unhygienic, suffocating, and because of dust mites, positively dangerous. Yet homeowners proudly displayed them as marks of wealth. You imagine lying there, sinking slowly into a feather trench, gasping for air, while your embroidered canopy muffles every breeze. Quirky tidbit: some reformers promoted iron beds as a healthier alternative, believing the metal frames resisted dust and pests. Others warned that sleeping in iron beds would expose you to magnetic disturbances that might rattle the nerves. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed magnetic fields disrupted sleep, or whether this was just another round of pseudoscience slapped onto household marketing. The room itself wasn't much better. Coal fires were standard for heat, filling bedrooms with smoke and fine black dust. Curtains, carpets, and upholstered chairs trapped it all. You picture a delicate lady brushing soot off her nightgown before tucking into bed. One manual sternly advised airing the bedroom daily, but with London's polluted air, opening the windows only swapped coal dust for street grime. Lighting played its part too. Gas lamps hissed faintly and leaked fumes. Some Victorians worried. The gas was poisoning them in their sleep, an anxiety that probably kept them awake longer than the lamp itself. Those who could afford oil lamps instead were still left with flickering shadows and the smell of singed wick. Today's advice says no screens before bed. Their equivalent might have been no gas lights before bed, which admittedly doesn't sound half as cozy. Another fixation was color. Household guides insisted that restful shades, soft greens, and pale blues encouraged slumber, while bold reds or golds overstimulated the brain. Yet fashionable decorators loved dark, dramatic palettes. You walk into one bedroom drenched in maroon velvet, with wallpaper patterned in black vines, and you think, no wonder the poor occupant lay awake at night. It feels less like a nest and more like the inside of a theater curtain. Of course, the Victorians didn't stop at color. They debated bed orientation too. Some claimed the head must face north to align with Earth's magnetic fields. Others argued that east was best, so you'd rise with the sun. Still others scoffed that such rules were nonsense. The scholarly debate here continues. Were these compass-based prescriptions grounded in serious medical theory, or just another example of the era's obsession with order and alignment? And then there were the accessories. Hot water bottles, warming pans filled with embers, and even bricks heated in the fire were tucked between sheets. Cozy? Yes, until you imagine the sudden shock of rolling onto a scalding panhandle in the middle of the night. Victorians also experimented with weighted blankets stuffed with heavy wool. Sound familiar? Today's weighted blankets are marketed as modern science, but the Victorians had already embraced the concept, just without the sleek branding. One housemaid confides to you that her mistress insisted on perfume sprinkled across. Pillows, believing lavender or rose water would summon dreams. The result was often overwhelming. A noseful of sharp floral scent that might soothe or suffocate, depending on your tolerance. In more eccentric households, camphor or vinegar-soaked rags were hung nearby to purify the air. You chuckle. If anything would keep you awake, it's falling asleep under a cloud of vinegar steam. Stepping back, you see the contradiction clearly. Victorians longed for restful bedrooms, but they also loved showy interiors, heavy fabrics, and endless decoration. The result was a sleep environment that was beautiful by daylight and oppressive by midnight. They had manuals insisting on plainness, doctors advising simplicity, and yet fashion always layered on more dot, so you linger in this ornate, chokingly perfumed chamber, surrounded by velvet, brass, and gaslight. It is, in its way, a museum of restless nights. And as you pull the thick curtains shut, shutting out even the street lamps, you realize the very design, meant to soothe the mind, may have been the thing that kept Victorians awake longest of all. You step from the smoky, velvet-draped bedrooms into a quieter world. Diaries, letters, and whispered confidences from women who struggled with sleepless nights. Here, insomnia wasn't just a medical concern. It was tangled with gender, expectations, and the weight of domestic duty. You flip open a leather-bound journal, the ink faded but legible, and red lines that ache with fatigue. 3 nights now without rest. The children stirred, the house required order, and still my mind would not cease. Asterisk mainstream fact. Victorian medicine often treated women's insomnia as a symptom of hysteria, that all-purpose label slapped onto everything from anxiety to simple boredom. A sleepless woman was said to have an overwrought imagination, or an overtaxed womb, yes. Doctors genuinely believed the uterus had nerves that sent mischief to the brain. You picture a physician gravely declaring, "Your insomnia, madam, is the fault of your reproductive organs," and wonder how anyone kept a straight face. Asterisk. But behind the absurd diagnoses lay the reality of women's lives. Middle and upper-class women were expected to manage households, raise children, and maintain strict social appearances. Nights were often interrupted by babies crying or servants knocking with household crises. Diaries reveal that women sometimes couldn't sleep, not because of frail nerves, but because their schedules simply left no room for rest. The scholarly debate here is telling. Were women's sleepless nights genuinely medical, or were they the natural consequence of overwork under restrictive roles? Historians still argue both sides. Asterisk quirky tidbit, corsets were sometimes blamed for insomnia, not just wearing them during the day, but the residual constriction left on the body, which some doctors said caused lingering agitation of the ribs. Imagine trying to relax when your torso feels like it's been squeezed by a boa constrictor for 12 hours. Little wonder some women lay awake gasping instead of snoozing. Asterisk, there's another side, too, the literary one. Women who wrote novels or poetry often confessed that their ideas arrived at night. Elizabeth Barrett Browning described sleepless hours filled with restless verses. For some, insomnia became part of the creative process, though the exhaustion it brought was carefully hidden from public view. After all, a respectable lady wasn't supposed to look worn or frazzled. Asterisk, and yet, despite the cultural restraints, some women carved out private rituals. A diary from 1872 mentions sipping a spoonful of sherry at 2 a.m., accompanied by needlework until the eyes blurred. Another describes reading psalms quietly by lamplight, hoping the rhythm of the verses would coax sleep. You imagine a dim nursery, the air heavy with candle smoke, as a mother rocks her child and then sits by the cradle, waiting for her own eyelids to grow heavy. Asterisk doctors, of course, often made things worse. Some recommended morphine syrups, freely given to women with insomnia. While they might produce short-term relief, dependence grew quietly. Cases emerged of ladies unable to function without their nightly draft, trapped in cycles of drowsiness and craving. Others were prescribed bromides, which dulled emotions along with wakefulness. One medical writer noted cheerfully that bromides restore modesty to the restless female. You sigh at the condescension. The cure for insomnia, apparently, was also the cure for personality. Asterisk in working-class homes, women's sleeplessness rarely made it into medical records. Yet oral histories suggest that many lived on fragmented rest up before dawn to stoke fires, tending infants at all hours, taking in laundry late into the night. There were no fancy bromides or physicians here, just exhaustion. Sleep wasn't something they lost. It was something they never had enough of to begin with. Asterisk, imagine sitting at a dressing table, brushing out your hair by candlelight, corset finally loosened, body weary, yet mind still racing with the day's tasks. Your pillow smells faintly of lavender water, sprinkled earlier in hope of soothing. Outside, a clock tower tolls 2, then 3. You sigh, knowing dawn will come too quickly. In the stillness, the velvet drapes and lace bedspread feel more like weights than comforts. The tension of women's insomnia lay in its invisibility. It was medicalized as hysteria, romanticized as creativity, or dismissed as fussiness. But in reality, it was the ordinary, relentless toll of lives lived under watchful eyes and rigid rules. Their sleepless nights weren't just about nerves. They were about the impossibility of rest, when so much was demanded and so little understood. Asterisk, and so. As you close the diary and blow out the candle, you carry with you the voices of countless women whose insomnia never made headlines but filled pages of private journals. Their quiet struggle whispers through time. Not every restless night is caused by sin or stomach sometimes. It is simply the weight of being expected to endure without pause. You leave behind the soft rustle of women's diaries and step into a noisier world. The offices, factories, and smoky clubs where Victorian men of industry wrestled with their own sleepless nights. Here, insomnia wasn't seen as weakness or hysteria. Instead, it was rebranded as the unfortunate but almost admirable byproduct of ambition. Picture a factory owner at midnight, hunched over ledgers, convinced his restless mind is proof of his productivity rather than his misery. Mainstream fact. Victorian medical journals often linked insomnia to overwork of the brain, particularly in professional men. Doctors warned that the pressures of commerce, finance, and constant decision-making strained the nervous system. But instead of slowing down, many men wore their sleeplessness as a badge of honor. Biographies of famous industrialists proudly mentioned nights spent awake, planning the next railway or calculating coal tonnage. Insomnia became shorthand for genius, or at least for being too important to rest. Quirky tidbit: one London banker confessed that he managed sleepless nights by pacing his study while smoking cigar after cigar. To soothe the nerves? The result? He coughed himself into exhaustion and mistook it for sleepiness. Others swore by black coffee at midnight, insisting it steadied the hands. You raise an eyebrow. A stimulant as a sleep cure? That's like dousing a fire with lamp oil and calling it firefighting dot in gentlemen's clubs. Conversations about insomnia often took on a competitive edge. I haven't slept more than 3 hours all week, one would boast. Another would counter, I conduct my best thinking at 2 in the morning. You picture a smoky room full of weary-eyed men, each pretending that dark circles under the eyes are medals of honor. Historians still argue whether this was genuine bravado or desperate justification for suffering bodies. Doctors, however, were less amused. They described railway spine and business brain as conditions tied to overwork and sleeplessness. Some recommended complete rest cures, sending men to country estates for weeks of silence and fresh air. Others prescribed tonics, bromides, or early forms of sedatives. Yet many men resisted, fearing that rest looked suspiciously like laziness. Better to drag themselves to the office yawning than admit they needed help. You wander into a textile mill owner's office. The clock shows 1 in the morning. Ledgers are stacked high, candles gutter, and the man rubs his temples. He takes a sip of brandy, another cure for wakefulness, and mutters about orders and wages. His sleeplessness is less a disorder than an occupational hazard, woven into the rhythm of capitalism. The scholarly debate here asks, did industrial modernity create more insomnia, or did it simply make people more aware of the hours they lost to wakefulness? The presence of clocks, trains, and strict timetables certainly made every lost minute feel measurable in profit. And it wasn't just business magnates. Clerks, lawyers, and even clergymen complained of sleeplessness from paperwork and sermons. One minister wrote that after preparing a fiery sermon, he lay awake rehearsing every line in his head, unable to switch off. You could almost sympathize. Nothing kills sleep. Like mentally replaying tomorrow's presentation for an audience that doesn't exist yet. Yet, for all their complaints, some men embraced the restless hours as opportunities. Thomas Edison, slightly later in history, famously treated sleep as a waste of time. Victorians before him carried similar sentiments. If I cannot sleep, one railway director wrote, I shall use the night to build my fortunes. You imagine him pacing, scratching notes by candlelight, fueled by sleepless determination. Was it admirable or absurd? Perhaps both. And then there were the less glamorous consequences. Reports mention men collapsing from nervous exhaustion, their bodies finally rebelling. Some were hospitalized, sent to seaside resorts, or quietly retired. Others turned to morphine or chloral hydrate to force themselves into unconsciousness. Their productivity may have been celebrated, but the price was often invisible in the public record. Picture yourself sitting in a Victorian study, papers scattered, a faint smell of cigar smoke lingering. Outside, the city pulses with industry, but inside, the silence feels heavy. You can almost hear the man's thoughts, clattering like factory gears, refusing to slow. He insists his sleeplessness is proof of his importance, yet his trembling hands betray otherwise. It's clear now that for Victorian men of industry, insomnia wasn't simply a nuisance. It was tangled with pride, productivity, and fear of failure. Their sleepless nights weren't entirely unwanted. They are also cultivated, bragged about, even celebrated. And so, as you leave the study and step back into the midnight streets, you carry the paradox with you. Sometimes insomnia wasn't the enemy of ambition. It was its chosen companion. You leave the clattering offices of industry behind and step into a dim parlor lit by a circle of flickering candles. The air smells of incense and kerosene, and the hush is broken only by the creak of chairs as a group of people lean forward, eyes wide. Welcome to the Victorian seance, where insomnia is not a medical condition, but a gateway, an opportunity to glimpse the spirit world. Mainstream fact. The mid to late 1800s saw an explosion of interest in spiritualism. Mediums claimed they could contact the dead, and sleeplessness became tangled in the story. Many spiritualists argued that night waking was proof of sensitivity, that those who struggled to sleep were closer to the veil between worlds. Rather than a disorder, it was framed as a mystical gift. Imagine lying awake at 3 a.m. and being told, Don't worry, you're not ill. You're just in tune with ghosts. Comforting? Perhaps not. Asterisk, one curious offshoot was mesmerism, a practice of inducing trance states, sometimes for healing, sometimes for spectacle. You sit in a high-backed chair while a mesmerist waves his hands in slow, deliberate motions. The room hums with expectation as he whispers, "You will rest. You will dream." In reality, you feel awkward, blinking in candlelight, but your neighbors swear they saw your eyelids flutter. Historians still argue whether mesmerism was hypnosis in embryo or pure theater. To a sleepless Victorian, it might not have mattered. The mere ritual of surrendering control was soothing in itself. Asterisk, quirky tidbit. Some mediums marketed spirit cures for insomnia, promising that ghostly hands would smooth the restless brow. One pamphlet described a woman who slept soundly only after the ghost of her grandmother stroked her hair in a seance. You smile, imagining the awkwardness of trying to snooze while strangers chant in your living room. Instead of silence, you get a chorus of table knockings. Asterisk, but seances weren't only for entertainment. For many grieving Victorians, especially after epidemics and wars, spiritualism offered comfort. Sleepless nights were filled with longing for lost loved ones. Mediums provided an explanation. Perhaps the reason you could not rest was that a spirit was trying to reach you. This framing turned sleeplessness into a sacred vigil rather than a problem to be cured. Asterisk, not all were convinced. Skeptics accused mediums of exploiting the sleepless and vulnerable. They noted how late-night seances often dragged on until dawn, leaving participants more exhausted than when they began. Doctors dismissed these gatherings as overstimulation, exactly the opposite of what an insomniac needed. Yet paradoxically, the exhaustion from staying up chanting in the dark sometimes did lead to sleep the next day. Perhaps the cure was just simple fatigue, wrapped in ghostly theatrics. Asterisk, you glance around the seance room and notice another detail. The tools of the trade. Crystal balls reflecting candlelight, pendulums swaying, and planchettes scratching faint messages. These weren't only mystical objects, they were props that demanded concentration. And concentration, when prolonged, could tip the brain into that pleasant state of fuzziness between wakefulness and dreams. Was it the spirits at work, or just the hypnotic rhythm of ritual? That debate has never quite been settled. Asterisk, one gentleman rises to give a testimonial. He claims that ever since attending seances, his insomnia has improved. He attributes it to nightly messages from his deceased wife. A skeptic in the corner mutters that he's just been staying up so late that his body eventually collapses into sleep. Both explanations carry a strange truth. Asterisk, the scholarly debate here runs deeper. Was Victorian spiritualism a religious movement, a psychological phenomenon, or simply a form of communal therapy for the sleepless and anxious? Historians still sift through diaries and seance transcripts, looking for clues. What's undeniable is that many Victorians genuinely felt calmer after these gatherings, even if their pillows were still as restless as before. Asterisk, quirky scene. A mesmerist once suggested that placing magnets under the bed would align spiritual energies and prevent nightmares. A curious lady tried it, only to complain the next morning that the magnets had slid together in the night with a loud clunk, jolting her awake. Not exactly restful. Asterisk, as you step out of the seance parlor, dawn's gray light creeps into the streets. The candles gutter, the voices fade, and you carry the impression of a night spent in eerie communion. Whether or not spirits ever soothed the sleepless, the rituals themselves provided structure, distraction, and perhaps the faint hope that wakefulness was not a curse, but a calling. You leave the world of seances and candlelit rituals and drift into a sunlit drawing room where heavy curtains are thrown wide and upholstered chairs are neatly arranged. A group of Victorians sit with teacups in hand, not discussing ghosts this time, but something far more mundane: naps. Yes, daytime dozing became a surprisingly heated debate in the 19th century, with scholars, doctors, and ordinary folk all weighing in on whether resting during the day was salvation for insomnia or its secret cause. Asterisk mainstream fact. Medical journals at the time often warned against daytime sleep. The logic was simple. If you stole slumber in the afternoon, you robbed yourself of the night's deep rest. Doctors advised strict discipline. Stay awake, even if exhausted, and the body will eventually comply with 8 full hours at night. You picture a pale Victorian clerk, propped up at his desk, eyelids drooping, sternly reminding himself that napping is sinful, as though morality hinged on staying awake through boredom. Asterisk quirky tidbit. Despite the warnings, many Victorians swore by 40 winks. The phrase itself became popular in the period, describing a short nap taken in an armchair, often right after lunch. Some guides recommended exactly 20 minutes, believing that was just enough to refresh the brain without sabotaging nighttime sleep. One eccentric physician even designed a nap chair with a timer that tipped the seat forward after a set interval, dumping the sleeper onto the rug. Effective, perhaps, but not exactly gentle. Asterisk historians still argue whether naps genuinely worsened insomnia, or whether this was another case of Victorian obsession with self-control. After all, cultures across the world, from Spain's siesta to China's midday rest, thrived on short naps without reporting epidemics of sleeplessness. Was Britain's anti-nap stance about health, or was it about productivity? Many scholars lean toward the latter. In an industrial age where every hour equaled output, naps looked suspiciously like laziness. Asterisk, in upper-class households, however, the rules bent. Ladies sometimes retreated to chaise longues in dim boudoirs, closing their eyes under the excuse of resting the nerves. Men at gentlemen's clubs occasionally nodded off in high-backed chairs, a cigar dangling precariously. These weren't admitted as naps, they were framed as brief reposes. The semantics allowed sleep without shame. You smile at the thought. If you can't nap, just rename it. Problem solved. Asterisk doctors couldn't agree either. Some recommended short rests to combat cerebral irritation, especially for scholars and clergymen. Others thundered against the practice, claiming it led to nightly disturbances of the brain. One particularly dramatic article insisted that napping encouraged nocturnal wandering of the thoughts and could even cause delirium. You almost chuckle. Delirium from a half-hour snooze? That's not science. That's caffeine withdrawal disguised as a theory. Asterisk, meanwhile, working-class Victorians didn't have the luxury to debate. Factory schedules and domestic service hours left little room for naps. Though oral histories suggest, workers stole quick moments of rest where they could, dozing in stairwells, leaning against walls, or slumping on benches during meal breaks. These snatches of sleep were survival tactics, not lifestyle choices. Ironically, the poor, who might have benefited most from sanctioned naps, were least able to take them. Asterisk, the cultural double standard becomes clear. The wealthy could nap in style, disguising it as nerve rest. The poor were scolded for laziness if caught doing the same. Once again, sleep was moralized, turned into a statement of class and discipline rather than simply biology. Asterisk, picture yourself now in that drawing room, teacup in hand, as the conversation drifts between scholars. One insists naps are fatal to proper rest. Another argues they are vital. A third recounts his personal schedule. I rest for precisely 27 minutes after luncheon. No more, no less. You try not to laugh. Insomnia may keep people up, but pedantry surely keeps them occupied. Asterisk, and the scholarly debate continues. Today, modern science suggests naps can help or hinder, depending on timing and length. Yet the Victorians, with their rigid sense of order, often saw only black and white. Either naps were virtuous or villainous. saviors, or saboteurs. No middle ground allowed. Asterisk. As the drawing room grows warm, your own eyelids droop. You glance at the chaise longue in the corner, velvet cushions plump and inviting. Would the Victorians scold you for reclining? Probably. Would it help you tonight? Almost certainly. And so, you close your eyes briefly, imagining the forbidden bliss of a stolen nap, knowing that for Victorians, even something as small as 40 winks could spark endless, sleepless debate. Asterisk. You leave the genteel drawing room behind and wander into a strange, echoing laboratory. It feels more like a steampunk novel than a place of medicine. Brass instruments glint in the lamplight. Wires snake across the floor, and the air hums faintly with the smell of heated metal. Here, in the late Victorian age, insomnia is no longer blamed only on lettuce broth or sinful novels. It has caught the attention of science-real, clunky, experimental science that is determined to measure dreams with rulers and record sleep with quills. Asterisk. Mainstream fact. By the 1880s and 1890s, physicians began to treat sleep as a subject worthy of laboratory study. Early sleep researchers used devices like kymographs, which traced breathing or pulse on rotating drums of paper. Imagine lying on a stiff cot, tubes attached to your chest, while a machine scratches out a wobbly line that supposedly proves whether you are peacefully slumbering or miserably awake. The idea was revolutionary. Sleep could be quantified. Whether it was restful, of course, remained another question. Asterisk. You peek over a doctor's shoulder as he inspects one such chart. Here, he declares proudly, pointing to a jagged dip. At precisely 2:13 a.m., the subject attempted to dream. You resist the urge to laugh. Attempted to dream? It sounds like someone bungling a piano piece rather than drifting into REM. Historians still argue whether these early graphs revealed anything meaningful or whether they were more showpiece than science. Asterisk. One quirky tidbit. Some experiments involved placing frogs or small animals beside patients, measuring how their breathing rhythms compared. Doctors believed animals might provide control data for the mysteries of human sleep. So you can picture it. A gentleman in pajamas lying on a cot, trying to fall asleep while a frog croaks indignantly in a glass jar beside him. Restful? Hardly. Asterisk. Another obsession was with brainwaves. Crude electrodes nothing like modern EEGs were strapped to scalps, attempting to detect electrical patterns. The signals were weak, the machines temperamental, and often all that emerged were squiggly lines that looked suspiciously like doodles. Yet these experiments thrilled researchers. If the brain made waves, perhaps insomnia could be detected and eventually cured. You can almost hear the optimism. Gentlemen, we are on the verge of bottling dreams. Asterisk. And then there was the interest in sleepwalking and night terrors. Doctors observed patients in darkened wards, jotting down every twitch or murmur. One report solemnly described a man who sat up at midnight, shouted, "Bring me the ledger," and fell back down snoring. The physician noted this as proof that business worries invaded the unconscious. The poor man's secret was out. Even in sleep, capitalism followed him. Asterisk. The scholarly debate that grew from these studies was lively. Was insomnia a problem of the nerves, the stomach, the soul, or now finally the brain itself? Some argued it was primarily mental overstimulation, measurable in nervous patterns. Others clung to older notions of digestion or morality. What's clear is that by the turn of the century, insomnia had become a medical frontier, with laboratories competing to pin it down like a butterfly specimen. Asterisk. Quirky invention time. One doctor built a sleep cage, a sort of padded enclosure meant to block sound and light. Patients were tucked inside and monitored through small slits, while the doctor noted how long it took before they surrendered to slumber. Some patients described it as oddly comforting, like a womb of cushions. Others said it was claustrophobic and kept them awake all night. You can imagine the awkwardness. "Doctor, I cannot sleep because you've locked me in a padded box." Asterisk, despite the failures, these experiments marked a turning point. No longer was insomnia purely moralized or treated with guesswork. It was something to be studied, timed, measured. The irony, of course, is that being studied probably made people more sleepless. Few things are less relaxing than a man with a stopwatch scribbling notes while you try to close your eyes. Picture yourself lying on that stiff cot, the frog croaking, the brass instruments ticking faintly. Your eyelids droop, but then a doctor leans over with a quill to mark your pulse. You sigh. If the cure for insomnia is surveillance, you'd almost rather have the lettuce water. Asterisk still, the ambition of these early labs laid the groundwork for modern sleep science. They didn't yet understand REM, circadian rhythms, or neurotransmitters, but they sensed sleep was measurable. And in their earnest attempts, with their wires, their frogs, their padded cages, they began to shift insomnia from superstition into science, one squiggly chart at a time. You step away from the brass instruments and clunky chimegraphs and find yourself once more in a quieter parlor, late in the Victorian age, when the old cures begin to fade. The shelves that once groaned with laudanum syrups and bromide tonics are being cleared, and the public has started to whisper that perhaps those miracle bottles were not so miraculous after all. Instead, new ideas, electric bulbs, psychology, and modern medicine cast their glow over the problem of sleeplessness, changing the way people understood their restless nights. Asterisk mainstream fact. By the 1890s and early 1900s, doctors were pulling back from the wild excesses of opiates and chloral hydrate. Concerns about addiction grew too loud to ignore. Medical journals warned against overprescription, and newspapers carried stories of once respectable families undone by dependency. The patent medicine market, once booming, began to draw criticism. For the first time, sleeplessness was no longer a condition to be drowned in syrup. It was to be studied, managed, and if possible, treated with restraint. Asterisk quirky tidbit. Some forward thinking. Physicians suggested that simply changing the newfangled electric light bulbs in bedrooms could cure insomnia. They claimed the brightness unsettled the nerves, and that softer, tinted bulbs might help. You chuckle, because you can almost hear today's sleep specialists echoing the same warning. Dim the lights, avoid overstimulation, keep your bedroom dark. The Victorians, in their own way, stumbled into familiar advice, though often by accident rather than evidence. Asterisk psychology also stepped into the scene. Theories from continental Europe began to filter into Britain, proposing that insomnia wasn't just about nerves or digestion, but about thoughts. The restless mind, they argued, needed new strategies, relaxation, structured routines, even early forms of talking therapy. You imagine a Victorian patient lying on a couch, telling his doctor about racing thoughts, while the doctor strokes his beard thoughtfully. Historians still argue whether these early psychological approaches were effective or merely theatrical, but they undeniably reframed the problem. Insomnia became less of a moral failing and more of a mental challenge. Asterisk, meanwhile, spiritual cures lost some of their luster. Seances still drew curious crowds, but fewer people linked their wakefulness to spirits. The language shifted. It wasn't ghosts knocking at the window. It was nerves, environment, or psychology. Likewise, moral lectures about sinful novels or self-abuse began to sound outdated in a culture increasingly enamored with science and progress. The Victorian night was modernizing, one sleepless evening at a time. Asterisk, and yet the irony remains. As gaslights gave way to electric bulbs and factories roared louder than ever, modernity brought new reasons for restlessness. If older generations struggled against soot and superstition, the Victorians at the century's end now battled deadlines, timetables, and bright artificial nights. Insomnia, in other words, did not disappear, it evolved, keeping pace with its age. Asterisk, picture yourself one last time in a Victorian bedroom. The coal fire has burned low. A small electric bulb glows faintly above, casting sharp shadows. On the nightstand sits an old bottle of bromide, nearly empty, dusty from disuse. Instead of reaching for it, you close the book you've been reading and think about the doctor's advice. Regulate your habits, dim the lights, breathe slowly. The advice feels strangely modern, almost timeless. Asterisk, the scholarly debate circles here. Did Victorian cures ever truly help, or did they simply give form to anxieties about a changing world? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. The lettuce broth and the laudanum, the seances and the sleep labs, they were less about success than about the need to try, to wrestle with the night in whatever way made sense at the time. And in trying, the Victorians left us a legacy of both absurdity and insight, a reminder that sleeplessness has always been both a personal struggle and a cultural mirror. Asterisk. And so the story of Victorian insomnia closes quietly, with cures fading, new sciences rising, and the hum of electric light filling the dark. Their nights may be long past, but their restlessness is familiar, echoing still in our own sleepless hours. And now, as the story drifts to a close, the pace slows. The edges of the narrative soften, and your own breathing becomes the quiet rhythm guiding you onward. You picture the lamps dimming in those Victorian streets, one by one, until the foggy gaslight glow gives way to silence and rest. The carriages have stopped rattling, the apothecaries have locked their doors, and even the restless industrialists, surrounded by their ledgers and clocks, have set down their pens. Asterisk, the heavy velvet curtains close, not to suffocate, but to shelter. The bed, whether feather mattress or iron frame, ceases to be a battleground and simply becomes a place to rest your weary limbs. The experiments, the gadgets, the sermons all fade away. What remains is the simple truth that night has always invited us to let go, even if it takes time to surrender. Asterisk, your thoughts, like theirs, may wander across half-finished plans, unspoken conversations, unanswered questions. But just as those 19th century sleepers eventually gave in, so too can you. Each breath settles you further. Each exhale carries away the noise of the day until only the soft hum of silence remains. Asterisk, there is no need to wrestle with the night, no need to measure its hours or bargain with its length. The story itself can fade now, slipping into the background like the dim outline of a dream. You are safe here, sheltered in your own quiet space, and the world can wait until morning. Asterisk, so rest now, as the Victorians tried to, but with none of their burdens, none of their panics, only the calm reassurance that sleep comes when it will, softly, inevitably. The lights are low, the hum is steady, and your eyes may close at last.